Welcome to Universal Talk. On today's show, we ponder spirit versus ego. Let's present the case. First, we must consider the human being as a whole, the mind, the body, and the spirit. What if our intuition was actually our spirit? What if the ego mind, or the ego, allowed us to rationalize life within our experience by using our five senses, including touch, smell, taste, sight, and hearing? What if the body was our guidance system to tell us when the ego and the spirit were out of balance? In a moment, we'll have Dr. Nickolas Martin on the show. He has a master's degree in the area of social work and school psychology. He also has a doctoral degree in education. He is a nationally certified school psychologist, a licensed psychologist in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He has also been a therapist in a mental health clinic for 22 years, a university professor for 24 years, and a consultant for the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation for 22 years. All of these experiences have taught him about the centrality and paramount importance of ego within a person's life, as evidenced in his new book, The Ego Unmasked. Dr. Nickolas Martin, welcome to Universal Talk.
Thank you, Joe, for having me today and having an opportunity to talk to your audience.
Wonderful. So how are you?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to talk about ego.
Okay. Well, let's get to it. So with all of your experience and, of course, your education, explain to the viewers what you feel ego is to you. Okay.
I think fundamentally the ego is the core essence of our humanity. Okay. And it is the part of our existence that deals with it's the foundation of our personality. Okay. It is the conduit through which much of our life is flowing, insofar as the 10 key life areas I discuss in the book, which I can maybe refer to later. Things like our close relationships with people we live with and our ability to deal with conflict and dealing with adversity and so on. It's also the psychological center of our universe. It's where a lot of what we do and what we live in this particular life is originating. Now, having said that, I've just spoken more or less to the importance of ego. In my book, I talk about components of ego, which deal more with our ego's size, ego's fragility, which deals with the vulnerability of our ego, and the permeability of our ego, which deals more or less with the flexibility. So it's those combination of aspects or components to our ego that make up what I call an ego type and influence our lives in profound ways.
I see. So do you counsel people on their ego?
Well, historically, what we have done over the years has been able to talk with people about aspects of life that ultimately are being affected by their ego. But the book that I've written really speaks more directly to the importance of ego and awareness of the ego more directly than may have been the case in the past, even when I was doing therapy in a mental health clinic, as well as the understanding of how to work with managing it in an effort to bring it into balance, and then ultimately to understand if it's truly been enhanced by understanding whether we are just thinking the new things that affect our ego in positive ways or actually living them.
I see. Okay. Well, I prepared a few questions here for you.
Thank you.
So hang on the line here. So do you believe in a mind-body-spirit connection?
Absolutely. I think that as a human being we have a duality involving our ego self that works with, or maybe not with, or against our divine self. And that a lot of times individuals who are seeking to move forward on the spiritual path and to awaken spiritually are having their abilities to move forward being interrupted by the workings of the unconscious ego in their lives.
Okay. So there, in your opinion, there absolutely is a correlation or a connection, I guess, would be a better way to put it, with the mind, the body, and the spirit.
Yes, there is.
Okay. Great. Let's see, what else do I got here for you? How long do you think this mind-body-spirit connection's been around? I mean, there's a lot of people out there that are saying this is all New Age thinking, and you know, in my mind, I'm thinking that this has been around forever. I mean, if you look at other disciplines in other countries, and you go back, this mind-body-spirit connection's been here forever, but we've kind of fallen away from that. And whether it be medicine or in just daily life even. And do you think that this has been around for a while, or this is New Age thinking?
No, this is not old, new stuff. This is really very old stuff, traditional stuff. If you look at writings of a spiritual nature, there's often an acknowledgement, either directly or indirectly, of the workings of the mind and or our human nature that create obstacles and issues for persons being able to experience the spiritual side of their being more fully. And what we're doing in terms of my book is refining our understanding, and that refinement speaks more directly to the unconscious ego, which is affecting people, yet they are not aware of it. And the traditional message, I just want to throw this out, have more or less been that we should be moving or shifting from an unconscious egoic functioning to spiritual consciousness or spiritual awakening. And in my work over the last 30 years, I don't think that happens. I think what really happens is people can learn more about what their ego is doing within their life, and if they can bring it into balance and make it healthier, then it coexists well, a consciousness which I call ego-spiritualistic consciousness, to move them to the place of being able to fully experience what they have to offer, both within their human or egoic self, as well as within their divine self. That's the new message, if anything, that I'm putting forth within the book.
Right, I like that. And that brings back what I was saying about balance with the mind, body, spirit. So a lot of times if a person's ego mind or their spirit is out of balance, I really think the body is has some kind of dis-ease, and that's where the word disease comes from. So depending where it is in the body, it's telling you something about yourself. And so, you know, in traditional medicine or mainstream medicine, we don't look at it that way. We're not taught that way. But because I've continued my education in other areas other than family medicine, such as Reiki energy and hypnotherapy, a lot of things come out that you don't expect. And through life's experience and through your work experience, a lot of times these types of things come out that you didn't know about or didn't expect, or almost some of these epiphanies that you become aware of. And it helps me become a better practitioner whenever I'm seeing patients in my office to know that the body's sitting there telling me something other than it's just a physical ailment.
Joe, I applaud you in your openness to understanding this triality, I think what you would call it, the body, mind, and spirit.
Thank you.
And I think historically the medical professions have been more locked into the idea that all these things that they deal with are mostly of a biological nature.
Right.
When, as we know from our work, that the psychology of our existence has an interplay with our physiology and our biology, and it also affects probably our spirituality.
Right.
So we need to think about all of those, not just one of those,
right,
and bringing people to health.
Right. I really think that I mean, I think that medicine recognizes each component, but in some cases, but I think it also separates it, where I think it's all intertwined, interconnected. I mean, there's a lot of research that's out right now that shows that there's a correlation with stress, anxiety, depression, whatever you want to call it, with altering DNA in cancer cells and viruses. So right off the bat, that tells me, you know, in the simplistic way, that when the body is stressed, which that means it's out of balance, and whether it's the certain perspective that that person holds and it's because of fear or doubt, it affects your DNA, which is physical. So
it's interesting you say that, because that is one of the 10 key life areas that I speak to in the book, our degree of stress sensitivity and how it is being influenced by the nature of our ego functioning, and as a result the ripple effect is that when we're out of balance in our egoic functioning, and particularly there's a type of egoic functioning I talk about called high fragility, which deals with the person who feels a lot of vulnerability within their life, a lot of which they've constructed up by themselves, that leads them to having physical kinds of symptoms that are pretty painful.
Right. Do you feel that the ego mind is difficult for each individual to look at, so to look at themselves because they don't want to see that in themselves, but deep down it's a truth?
Absolutely. I think that's the whole purpose of the book and the title, The Ego Unmasked, because the term the ego mask would mean that it's functioning at an unconscious level in a very powerful way. And the ego has all kinds of ways of helping us not to see ourselves as we truly are. And I just would add that it's kind of painful to do that. But beyond the pain is the healing and the imbalancedness of both our ego functioning that helps us to experience the spiritual aspects of our being.
So do you feel that through counseling or just simply talking with somebody and showing them almost as a mirror image to show them how they're presenting, because they, like you say, they may unconsciously, they might not know what they're doing, and have them really take a look at themselves, does that help them change their behavior and therefore change their inner being and maybe change the balance within themselves?
Well, I think that it requires an even more intense focus on ego, and that's, in the book I talk about ego therapy and mental medicine, which really involves basically reality-based thought, the power of reality-based thought, as well as developing an awareness of our ego and how it's functioning in our lives, that it has to be more focused and concentrated than maybe historically it has been. I believe in the cognitive view of understanding our illnesses and also the solution to working to help us go beyond those. But I think they're a little bit weak from the standpoint that they really don't go after and look at a person's ego more directly. Yeah. And once they do, they are in a stronger position to work with this core of their being.
Right. Yeah. So basically, I'm looking at this overall picture, thinking that, you know, this would really be helpful to people that are very stressed out about the way their life is because of what the lifestyle they're living, and they may not even know the pitfalls that they're putting before themselves. So just to have the concept to even look at your ego as something that can be changed, because many people might not even have the awareness that, hey, I need to look at my ego, or I need to check my ego, a lot of people will say without knowing. But if you're in an ego state of mind and it's like a negativity type of a thing, and that's just how you're living your life because that's who you are, but not realizing who you're hurting all around you, which kind of hurts you in the long run, just having that concept to look at yourself and, oh, wow, I'm in my ego right now, I better check myself, and maybe I shouldn't have said that, or maybe in the next time that happens, I'll do things differently. Well,
I think the problem there could be that the person will continue to repeat that behavior or that thinking or even experiencing those feelings unless they get a more precise understanding of exactly what their ego is about. And that's what occurs within the book. The book basically teaches people what ego is. And then it takes them into helping them find their specific ego. Right. Because not all egos are the same. And that's been one of the messages that have been put out there by some other writers, that there is in some respects a generic ego. Mm-hmm. And my book says, no, there isn't. The egos differ both in terms of their content as well as their structure. Right. And so your ego is different to my ego as opposed to somebody else's. Right. So it helps, and it's important to people to tune in to their ego specifically and how it is being lived by them, and that's what the book attempts to do. Okay, so I got a what if for you then. So what if each individual person, and therefore ego, and therefore spirit and body, which we can physically see everybody's body is different, and by how people communicate and what goals they have in their lives, their egos are a little bit different, and within their spiritual context, like religions, there's differences. So what if, before we incarnate into this lifetime, the soul that we come in with, of course you're saying it's probably different, and I mean there's different soul growths. What if it's, you know, an older soul than somebody else? And then therefore, what if the body is different, which we've already established? What if the ego is from birth the whole way up to whatever age you are now, is if it has different experiences, does that change how you relate in a day-to-day life?
taking those three components and putting them together, whether it be a different soul growth within the body, having different souls, you know, different evolutionary processes, I guess, with the different ego, which I think, and you can correct me, that you're the expert here, from birth until, say, you're 50 years old, all the experiences that you've experienced with the five senses, does that allow you to change your ego in different ways?
I think it's difficult for people to. It does alter or affect people's experiences within this lifetime. Will modify their ego.
Okay.
But up till this point, there really hasn't been a strategy to go into it and look more directly at it. As I say in the book, the mind is a very large place to go into to find yourself, and you need direction. So, in most cases, a lot of people have a difficult time truly coming to that grasp and understanding of them that's being shaped or influenced by this particular lifetime, in addition to maybe what they've come into this life from other lifetimes. But
before you go on there, you said other lifetimes. So some people feel that we come into this life and, you know, we live this one lifetime and then that's it, we're done. And we go back to heaven or we go to hell, and depending on the religion. Do you personally feel that we live more than one lifetime?
Well, if you understand humans as being energy, and life is energy, and energy then is something that apparently cannot be destroyed. So the energy that you and I are living at this point is just energy that has been transformed from a different state, from a past, and will probably continue onward into the future. This is not alien to what our religions teach us. Our religions talk about life after death and talk about the movement into the spiritual realm. So that is not New Age. That's very consistent with what has been discussed before.
Right. So basically, what's refreshing to hear you say is, you know, somebody that's working in psychology takes a look at the mind-body-spirit connection, and you're actually speaking of the spirit. And it makes sense to people once they study the entire whole of the human being. Whereas when you separate it, they just simply don't make sense. And that's what I'm trying to do with this show, is to kind of put all these pieces together, whether we're talking about spirituality or down the road, whether we're talking about the ghostly realm or whatever we get into on the show going down, you know.
Joe, just to insert a thought, which is something, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So if we over-focus on one specific area or one part, only the mind, only the spirit, only the body, and we overdo that without finding a way to really work with them and connect them together to make a more coherent and greater whole than those separate parts would mean, we miss it. We would miss a lot. And so in some respects, I'm not your typical psychologist, because I'm not only focused on that aspect of our being, that is our psychological being. I'm also receptive and open to the spiritual parts of our being that also have a profound effect on the quality of life that we can experience in this particular physical existence. Similar to you, you're a healer, and I'm a healer. And in order to do the whole job of healing and working in that direction, it is incumbent upon us to know everything as much as we can know it in order to move that forward.
Right. I totally agree with you. And like I said, it's refreshing to hear it from somebody from a different discipline. Now, like you say, we're both healers, but I practice family medicine, and you are a psychologist. So even though you're more focused on the mind maybe, and I'm more focused on the physical, we're both taking the holistic approach of mind, body, spirit. And I really think that medicine should come back to that. And education and self-empowerment to allow the individual that wants to be healed to help themselves, rather than relying on each individual practitioner, regardless of the discipline, to say, you fix me, or just give me a pill. Because really, if they do go internally and they take a look at themselves, whether they go internally and check their ego or their spirit, and I think their body would come back into balance. So, where do you see yourself maybe in the next few years?
Well, the book is obviously a very important part of where I'm going. There's a message within the book, and, and the message includes first of all, just to help people better understand what ego is. And ego does not have to be our enemy. It can become our friend, and that friendship forms as we become to understand it, and we work to manage it into being in balance. And I think getting that message out, the traditional messages about ego have been, well, if we can bring it into awareness, we can disown it, dissolve it, defeat it, or whatever. But that's not really what happens to people. The ego's always going to, in effect, be there as long as they are physically living here. So it's a matter of developing and cultivating that friendship in conjunction with that openness to our spiritual life and self that allows us to live the fullest of lives that we can experience.
Right. So basically, if I'm hearing you correctly, it would be better to balance the spirit and the ego together, because we are on this three-dimensional physical plane that we experience things in with our five senses, rather than to try to get rid of our ego, because basically we're us.
Right, and I think the message that I'm putting forth is that our ego is a wonderful, beautiful part of our humanity that can coexist with our divine self, that those two forces, both very positive and very healthy in our being, can offer us the opportunity to experience the most out of life in those 10 areas that I talk about in my book. The one concern I have is I've worked with a lot of people, and I see that over time, it's like the movie As Good as It Gets. They sort of settle for less rather than more that there is available within their life. And that doesn't have to be the case. If we just get a handle and understanding of what our ego is about and how we're living it, how we can learn to live it better, it's a tremendous friend. And it works with it's part of our humanity. To help our audience better understand, even the word ego and human are probably synonymous. Your ego self is your human self. Your human nature is your ego nature. Your ego consciousness is your human consciousness. That we have to work with that directly, and as a result, the combination of the two give us the opportunity to experience the greatest and the most fullest of lives.
Okay, so what are some differences from what you teach compared to what others have put out in the past in regards to ego?
Okay, I kind of already talked a little bit about them, but for example, there are really two consciousnesses that we are working with. One would be our ego consciousness or human consciousness. Unfortunately, a lot of what people are living is a lot of their ego unconsciousness in how they are in their lives. The book goes into detail what that looks like for people. And we also have our spiritual consciousness. In the website that I have connected to the book, which is theegounmasked.com, I explain how there's a path, and that path doesn't simply ask us to jump, so to speak, from our ego unconsciousness to spiritual consciousness. There are two steps in between that, and the next step beyond our ego unconsciousness would be our ego consciousness. Again, the term, the ego unmasked, would be the idea that we are understanding and becoming aware of that egoistic part of our being in a more direct, clearer way. And then as a result of that awareness and that knowledge, we can work to bring it into balance and make it healthy. And as a result of its healthiness, we then move toward what I call ego-spiritualistic consciousness, which is the balance between the egoic, healthy functioning of our being along with our spiritual consciousness working together. And those are two discussions that have not been out there that I'm putting forth. But the other things I've talked about, the ego can be our friend. It doesn't have to just be our enemy. Our ego doesn't have to be dissolved. It doesn't have to be defeated. It doesn't have to be disowned. That your ego can be in the present, and be in peace in order to function in that kind of way.
Do you feel that some of the people that have mental illnesses, if they could have an awareness or focus on their ego, do you think that would help them heal in any way?
Absolutely. I think that's the core issue for all of us in terms of our psychological difficulties. From a psychological perspective, it's the egoic functioning that's playing out, whether the disturbance that they're experiencing is because the ego size is too big and they're intoxicated with the power that they have or want to have in life, or whether people have what would be called a small ego size. Those are often people that are depressed and feel helpless and hopeless in their lives, but in fact they are much more capable than they know themselves to be. They've just convinced themselves that they are not capable, but they truly are. Or the person with the low permeability, as I talk about in the book, who's very inflexible, persons who are racist, persons who are extremists in ways that are destructive, are living that kind of egoic existence, and unfortunately their difficulties often occur within not only their immediate situations, but oftentimes they are visited upon others. Or the high fragility person, the person with a lot of stress, they live in a state of stress, and if they're not stressed, they'll find something to be stressed about. All of these things really have a linkage to the ego and how it's functioning in their lives, but they're not aware of it. So shining light on it, teaching them about the power of reality-based thought and ego awareness is really the primary strategy to help them to heal, something they haven't been using.
Right. Okay. So the website you mentioned, maybe you could give the viewers the website again and tell them what they can expect to find whenever they log on to your website.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. The website location is www.theegounmasked.com. At the website, I go into a page, I have several pages. One of them is just an overview of what the book is about, and in terms of what the different chapters are attempting to accomplish, and what they're trying to, what the reader will experience if they have a chance to read the book. There's also what I mentioned earlier, the path, and that discusses each of those steps along this shifting of consciousness from ego unconsciousness to ego consciousness to spiritual, ego spiritualistic consciousness, and finally spiritual consciousness. They will encounter the audiences for whom this book was intended, which broadly speaking involved people, the lay community, who will have an opportunity to work with something more immediate and more directly if they cannot have the opportunity or time to go outward to work with somebody else. One of the statements I make in the book is that sometimes the only person that can reach you is you. And so the effort of the book is to give the person that opportunity to do that for the persons in a lay community. But beyond that, the book also, the audience's page discusses how it is for mental health professionals, giving them an opportunity to encounter and experience a thorough, comprehensive, yet specific coverage of the concept of ego, something that they are working directly with. And then the metaphysician practitioners who are working with people to help them move forward in their spiritual awakening and development, and understanding the egoistic energies that often are forces that are working against their particular efforts. So the audience page speaks to that. There's also some discussion of presentations that I do in conjunction with the Ego Unmasked, as well as a presentation with my wife, who is a metaphysician practitioner, Dr. Linda Martin, that focuses specifically on ego spiritualism and the consciousness I was referring to, where one's ego is in balance and working with their divine self.
So you two complement one another.
Absolutely. I think that the message of my book originally was primarily one connected to the ego realm, but as I've been learning in the past 5 to 10 years more about matters relating to the spiritual realm, it has served as an excellent complement to what I already understood and had been learning through the people who've taught me over 30 years. In fact, I would say the primary source of knowledge for this book have been people, the egos of the people that I have worked with. And when you've encountered 30,000 or more of those over time, you see some of the patterns and the redundancies that play out in people's lives in this realm that you learn from.
Okay. All right. So when we return, we'll be talking to Dr. Martin more about his book, The Ego Unmasked. And we'll be right back.
From the all-powerful a brain.
People wonder how I got to be the all-knowing Wizard of Oz. I go to USA.gov, the official source for government info.
Pick up the student loan form to your right. Next!
I want to go back to Kansas.
Oh, that's a toughie. Back to USA.gov, passport applications.
For federal and state government information, there's no place like USA.gov. Scientists are constantly discovering new ways to protect our children. Now, important scientific research shows how to protect our children right here. Fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and other vegetarian foods help prevent weight problems, heart disease, and cancer from occurring later in life. For a crash course in feeding your kids right, call 866-906-WELL.
Welcome back to Universal Talk. And we're here with Dr. Martin, and we're going to talk about his book, The Ego Unmasked. But before we do, I'd like to give the phone number out, which is 814-946-8496. And if you have any questions you'd like addressed or thoughts you'd like to talk with Dr. Martin about, please give us a call. Again, that number is 814-946-8496. Okay, so this is the book you've been referring to the whole time. And what would you like to talk to our viewers about with this book?
Well, I can start off by letting you know that obviously you can see it's a pretty large book. Mm-hmm. It doesn't comport to what most self-help books are about, supposed to be size-wise, meaning 300 pages or so. And all I can tell you is, in writing the book, one of the voices inside of me said, don't leave anybody out and don't leave anybody behind. Mm-hmm. And so if I was going to write a book on ego, it was going to be intended for everybody, right. Not just some people, but everybody. And the size of the book is affected by the fact that, in effect, it's a nonfiction novel about my life, your life, and everybody's life, with ego being the primary foundation behind this discussion of a person's life. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, I think it also gets into the ego in ways that are far more intensive, concentrated, but specific, so people can have a better handle. And there's a lexicon in the book. I talk about ego space, and I talk about ego collisions, and I talk about ego blindness, as well as the ego components of ego size, ego fragility, and ego permeability. And they develop this familiarity on the part of the reader as to what ego truly is and how they're living it. So the ego is it's a very large concept. It affects us tremendously, and so a book that recognized that couldn't be reduced to a few hundred pages only. But beyond that, the book is also, as I said, the three audiences before, so I won't repeat that, the laypersons, the metaphysician practitioners, and the mental health professionals. But it also it's actually a theory of personality rooted on the concept of ego and centered, including the components of ego. It's a theory of pathology, which talks about, we talked about the first half a little bit about the role of ego in terms of the pathology that people can exhibit. And finally, it's a theory of treatment, which centered on the concept of ego therapy and mental medicine. So it's more or less one-stop shopping for a lot of people. Yeah. They can come to and see something they've not had the opportunity to experience before. Okay, so do you see this being taught in universities? Absolutely. I think it's something that is needed. If a mental health practitioner is working with a person's ego fundamentally, the more they understand and that they know about how this egoic portion of a person's life is at work, the stronger the position that you're in to do the work of healing, which is ultimately what they're there for. Right. Yeah. As you're talking about this, I'm thinking to myself, I said, this would make a really good textbook or a supplement to in universities across the world for people that are going into psychology, psychiatry, whatever, mental health, and not to mention that, you know, the subspecialties and even the other disciplines such as family medicine and any other areas that would come into contact with people that have mental health issues. And that's pretty much across the board, regardless of where you work. I mean, you know, OBGYNs, pediatricians, just about anybody in the medical field anyway. And as far as the religious discipline, I mean, priests or preachers, I'm sure they have to counsel daily the various aspects of people's lives, and ego is a part of it. Well, Joe, you're speaking to the breadth of different practitioners, and the common element across all of us, across the world, is that we all have an ego.
Right.
Now, we not know what it is or understand it very
Right.
well, but we have one. And so the purpose of the book is to shine light in an area that I think has had a lot of darkness.
You know, it's something, going back to what you said, I teach my patients this a lot of times, is that they want to get out of here. They don't like this town. It's the town is the problem. But whenever I talk to them, I'm like, you know, the problem is you're taking you with you when you go to Arizona or Hawaii or wherever you plan on going where it's a paradise. You take you with you, and until you deal with the inner you, which is part of the ego, the spirit, the mind, body, spirit, then you're still going to have difficulties wherever you go.
And just echoing what you're saying there, I talk about something called ego space, which is within our mind. It's what's on our hard drive, so to speak. It's all the thoughts and the beliefs and the interpretations and delusions and everything, and attitudes and values we carry. And if we're walking around with things that are not serving us well, that they are the equivalent of mental viruses, it doesn't matter whether you're in Altoona or Pittsburgh or Hawaii.
Right.
Those are going to be there until you deal with them. And that's why what often happens to people is they can change the place, but they're still there. It's all there.
Right.
And they have to work with it. But they didn't know it was there to be worked with, and that was their solution. Go somewhere else and it'll change. In most cases, it doesn't.
Right. I see a lot of people that will travel to another part of the world and then they come back. And so whether it's just simply what we're talking about, they took them with them and then they come back to a more comfortable space, because sometimes when they move away, they don't have the support groups that they had here. And sometimes it's more difficult and they don't really see it. But a lot of times I see it as a learned lesson, and sometimes it helps to allow them to recognize their own ego, or that there is a difficulty other than just the location where they live.
And that opportunity to learn that lesson, that is, I changed my location, but I didn't change me.
Right.
And that can be a helpful experience for some people, but unfortunately, I find that due to the power of the ego unconscious at work in people's lives, there's still much more of an emphasis on looking outside of themselves rather than inside and really seeing what needs to be seen.
So when someone comes into you and they have a really, you talked about different various egos and the permeability. So what if they have a intense ego? And how do you begin to help them, and how do they help themselves heal with something like that?
Basically, depending on the nature of their ego component. For example, if they are a low permeability person, and those persons tend to believe that they know the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and that you can't tell them anything different. In a lot of those cases, when that person looks closer at their lives, they see that the life they're living, they're not happy with. There's, in fact, a lot of anger. And so the question is do you want to hold on to the anger, or do you want to lose the anger? And if they aren't willing to address that, then there's not a lot maybe I can do. So I think the first place we go to is to tell them, look at your life, look at the 10 key life areas, look at how you're functioning in those close relationships with your wife or girlfriend, or, and so on, companion, or look at your self-esteem and see where that's at. And so the 10 key life areas are the mirrors. The self-esteem is the relationship I have with me. That's my relationship with me, and whether it's healthy or unhealthy. And I help them to look into those mirrors to see if, in fact, it's working or not working for them. And if they want to see distortion and say, yes, it's working for me, but you can see from your vantage point that it's not working well, there isn't anything I really can do.
Right.
So I try to encourage them to look into the mirrors of those 10 key life areas to see how it's working or not, if they're satisfied or whether they think there's room for improvement. And if they can acknowledge at least something can change for the better, that's opening the door a crack in terms of getting closer to what they might want to experience.
Right. And then does it become a process, I guess? A person's not, if they're that intense and have such a low permeability, as you say, it becomes a longer healing time, would you think?
Yes, I would think the more your ego component is at an extreme, and by extreme I'm talking about the low permeability person who may be rigid, inflexible, and a lot of other things I could go into, or the person who's got a lot of fragility. They live in a world of fight or flight, stress, anger, intense anxiety. They don't get over it as quickly. I think Woody Allen personified in some of his movies those kinds of characters who are anxiety-ridden. It's going to take more time, but at the very least they have an opportunity to see why it is that way.
Right.
It's why it is that way, and then to move in a direction of what can I do about it in a very precise, specific way, which gets into the mental medicine discussion.
Right. It's pretty difficult sometimes, because I deal with a lot of mental health in my practice, and I would have to say probably estimating it'd probably be at least 50% of my practice. And in family medicine, people think that you see the common cold and you do sutures and things like that, but really there's a lot of mental health. And to educate the person and to allow them to see themselves, a lot of times I have to put it right back on them and say, are you ready to hear this? Because a lot of times they don't want to hear it. And if they're not ready, there's no point in even discussing it.
There's a warning that sometimes I would like to attach to my presentations at the very beginning, which is this book can be painful to you. And this presentation can be somewhat painful, at least at the beginning part of it, because seeing ourselves as who we really are rather than who we think we want to see ourselves as, often there's that difference there, and it's a shock.
Right.
And it blows people away. But once they get through that, once they open their mind and know where to look to find themselves, it opens the door to the change. Because inside every person is a good person and a smart person. It's just that our ego, as I say in the back matter of the book, can make us stupid.
Right.
It's made me stupid in my past, and sometimes even today, in terms of maybe what I'm thinking or what I'm feeling or what I'm doing, or and so understanding that I think the major clarification for the patient who is actually a student of themselves, is to understand that the movement is to move us beyond that pain into a very healthy place that allows us to really fulfill who we can truly be. One of the saddest statements I think in the book is that many people live their lives never knowing who they are and who they could have been, because their ego unconsciousness kept them locked and lost in it. And so the purpose of the ego unmasked is to open that door, shine that light, look at that ego, understand your specific ego, and give you a strategy for which to work with it and to move it forward, because you are a good person and you are a smart person, but your ego just overwhelms that a lot of the time.
Do you feel that the ego is influenced through conditioning of the culture or what we've been told, and whether some people call it we're dumbed down and we're actually more than what we've ever been told or thought that we were?
I think there are conditioning processes. One of my learnings in my professional training include behavioral psychology, and I think there is conditioning that plays upon or preys upon our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors and can keep us locked there. In the book I discuss something called secondary ego fragility, where we learn to be anxious or we learn to be angry in reference to certain things, and understanding what that is and why that is as a process, rather than I really need to be angry about certain things when in fact that's not the case. It's just we learned it.
Do you think that the anger is kind of like a protective mechanism, that they feel that they have to put that out there so that...
I think in many cases, for males more so than females, it is. The one emotion that males seem to have permission to exhibit is anger. And as a result, the whole thing about being powerful, and if one has to be angry sometimes to exhibit power or be macho, when in fact a lot of that's very much weakness. In fact, one of the things I often see in people is the more angry they are on the outside, the more scared they are on the inside. It's sort of the mirroring of that emotion. It's just that's a permissible emotion for a male to exhibit, but in actuality he's very afraid.
Yeah, the same with the conditioning that men aren't allowed to cry. That's not...
Well, part of that is an evolutional influence because males have been outdoors doing a lot of hunting and building and killing things, whether it's plants or animals or people, in the name of survival or protection. But our media has also done, unfortunately, a negative, put a lot of negative messages about emotionality and feelings and weakness. And for younger people, meaning children below the age of 10, and particularly boys, hearing that they're not allowed to cry, they're not allowed to express feelings, that sort of coincides with the John Wayne mentality that previous generations of males were brought up with. That misses the boat. The really healthy part of our existence is, in terms of our humanity, is experiencing a healthy sense of all vulnerability. We are imperfect, and our world doesn't always play out in a perfect way, and rather than resist it or disown it, why don't we work with it through having a healthy, balanced ego fragility component that allows us to laugh when we need to laugh and cry when we need to cry. Right. Those are the healthy people in your life. Right.
So the people that suppress that, whether it be the frustration, the anger, the fear, the emotional tears, a lot of times what we're finding is that through research, of course, that there's dis-ease that's caused from holding this all in. And a lot of people, you know, they say it without knowing the deeper meaning of it, but they make comments like, well, you got to let it out, you got to get it off your chest, but really there's an inner meaning behind that. And I really think that the people that come in, they have this inner imbalance, and they hold things back instead of being allowed to express it and get rid of that energy. We were talking about energy earlier. So if you have a negative energy that's inside you that you need to express out, and so you can get rebalanced, a lot of times it causes the dis-ease that we talk about.
Right, and I think that's the thinking that's behind that is part of what I call the virus, that particular virus that says expressing feelings is weak. Would be what I would call a virus, and that's not reality. The reality is that we were designed by God to be able to express ourselves in those ways when we need to. And you're looking at somebody who's cried probably very infrequently over the course of my life, but when I need to do it, I do it. Right. It doesn't have to last for days, but it happens, and that's the permission you give to yourself as a healthy, egoic human being to do it. Right. And so messages that have attached weakness, or particularly for males, has not been helpful. It's actually been destructive and harmful. And ultimately what ends up happening is that emotion goes somewhere else. As you were just speaking to it, it may go into physiological symptoms, the disease that the person acquires, or it may go in the direction of what I call cognitivized emotion. The person is feeling angry, they can't express it, so they start thinking angry thoughts, or they like prejudicial thoughts, or they start to steal from people, but they don't feel the anger, but they're angry. And so there's that, they've been confused by the messages they may have heard at a very young age that were distorted in terms of what it meant to be a healthy, functional human being in the egoic sense.
And some of what you're saying also leads back to the conditioning from generation to generation. Like if a person has been taught, I guess you would say, through their parents hitting them, then they feel that it's acceptable because they've experienced it, and therefore their ego has been conditioned because of that experience, and therefore that becomes an acceptable part of their household. And when they are frustrated, they've also learned that we need to not cry or express ourselves in these manners. So now all of a sudden child abuse is a lot easier to the person, and it's okay to their mind. They make it okay. But really, if you showed them some footage of what they just did, it would be shocking to them.
What you've just spoken to, particularly with children, and you know, the child at a very younger age, I talk about this in the book, developmentally, is a very permeable ego. You can pretty much download anything onto the child's mind because they have no reference point, no filter, probably before the age of 5 or 6, from which to think this isn't right, this isn't appropriate. So if they're watching their father or their mother abuse their other parent verbally or physically, it just becomes part of what's onto their mind with regard to that, and it doesn't help them, and they just think that's normal.
Right.
I mentioned in the book about the quote, hell of child abuse is the fact that the perpetrator often says things psychologically or physically or sexually in ways that distort in the child's mind their ability to understand what's normal and what's not normal. Right. And adults have a difficult enough time letting go of things like that. It's much even more difficult for a child.
Right. I've seen that. I used to work at the Meadow Psychiatric Center, and the most disheartening thing to me was to go into the children's unit and to see these 5-year-old children in a psych lockdown. And it was difficult for me to watch and to understand why these children were there, but knowing that the permeability, as you suggest, is so much that the child don't know what normal or abnormal is, and that's what their education is from their life's experience, whether it be traditional education or through life's experience from the parents and who surrounds them. So what happens is, I think that they get some type of a fracture in the normalcy that they develop. Plus, they're so much more influential at that age than as an adult. If they would experience a traumatic event similar to what a child would, the child would not know how to handle it and not know how to express themselves, whereas the adult could rationalize it, and through their life's experience, what's normal and abnormal, they come out of it a little better.
One example connected to what you were just speaking, I can think of, is Dr. Abraham Torsky, who was the founder of Gateway Rehabilitation Institute. I had him come down to Cal University, where I teach, to present to our psychology club a number of years back, and he explained that all of the alcoholics that he had worked with all shared with him that they had self-esteem related difficulties, and that the origins of those self-esteem problems began as early as age 4 for the most part, and which meant that they were really, a lot of these young people were encountering different forms of abuse or neglect that were laying the foundation for the relationship they had with themselves, a relationship they started to address by using chemicals to distance themselves from whatever pain they were experiencing.
Right. Yeah, so, I mean, everything we're talking about is day-to-day life. It hits on every single person, because every single person has an ego. You speak about it in your book. It's quite thorough, as you can see. And I really think that this would be beneficial to the various disciplines across the board, and also in universities, and not just psychology, but just as a general subject to talk about, because it helps you in your day-to-day life. I mean, I really think this is an important work that you're doing, and having the ability to combine the mind, body, spirit within it speaks of our true nature, which is humanity. So, cool. Good job.
Thank you.
We have probably somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes left here, and what I'd like you to do is maybe talk about your website one more time, give the viewers your the website, and then
I could speak to that.
Yeah.
Okay, the website is located at, again, www.egounmasked.com. It's simply the book with the .com added. And that location are a number of pages, an overview of what the book is about itself. I mentioned earlier the path in terms of moving from different types of consciousness and the shift of those consciousnesses. The audiences for whom the book is intended. I also talk about what ego is to give the reader, the potential reader, more of an opportunity to know what I'm saying about it, some of which we talked about today. I also have a page on the vision and message of the book, which is basically explaining what is new or what is different about the book compared to what has been said before, and then the presentations. With regard to the book itself, it's been divided into basically 3 major subsections. The first subsection is ego awareness, and those are the first 5 chapters of the book. The first chapter beginning with just discussing what the importance of the ego is. But the next 3 chapters are dealing with different concepts, ego-related concepts, as well as the 10 key life areas. I try to integrate the core concepts with these areas the mirrors, which I call them, of the 10 key life areas, so people can have a better understanding of what is he talking about? What does he mean by that? What does it mean to have a big or a large ego size or a low ego permeability, so that people can more gradually, in a graduated way, understand what is this? And then chapter 5 goes into the discussion of different ego types that people might be living, and that's where people over time would have the opportunity to just sort of tune into their ego and get a better sense of what it is. Because as we said earlier, the ego can play tricks on us, or it can distort how we actually know it or see it within ourselves, and the objective is to truly find who we are. And so by spending time looking into the mirrors of the 10 key life areas, understanding the egoic concepts I talk about, and trying them out in the real world, seeing where it's at, we come to some understanding of where our ego is and what we need to do. And that leads to the second part of the book, which is chapters 6 to 11, which deals with ego management. And there I go into the specifics of what these different ego components are doing in reference to the 10 key life areas, particularly the inaccurate thoughts that they might be exhibiting, and the needed mental medicine to help work with that particular component. Then finally, the last third of the book is ego enhancement, where it's basically connected to the previous chapters, insofar there's a chapter on decreasing ego size, which is tied to the large ego size chapter of chapter 7. It simply gives examples of how the person knows, in fact, they have arrived, they truly are living the change, not just thinking it.
Do you think that if this was taught at an earlier age, say in the kindergarten, K through 12, that people's lives would be different?
When you say teach it, you're talking about to the particular children themselves?
Yep. To start young from the very beginning, to know that this is something that's an awareness that, hey, you have an ego. You have a mind, body, spirit. Your ego is this. And just briefly, we have about 3 minutes.
That's an excellent question. I hadn't gotten to the place where I had contemplated this to be for an audience below the age of maybe an adolescent.
Now, the book might not be for that, but do you see where I'm going with this?
Yes, I think so. And I think in terms like we talk about self-esteem and healthy self-esteem, one of the things that's going on out there is there's a misunderstanding of what healthy self-esteem is.
Right.
And the idea is that we should make help our kids to have high self-esteem.
Right. And
in college at Cal U, when I talk to my students, I say, no, we don't want them to have high self-esteem. We want them to have healthy self-esteem. And healthy self-esteem is this healthy esteeming of oneself along with healthily esteeming others. I've talked to a lot of people out there who have worked with young people who come into a situation where they have a lot of high self-esteem, meaning they have a great relationship, they love themselves, they are in love with themselves, but unfortunately they don't show the same regard for others.
Right.
And that's not healthy self-esteem. It may be high, but it's not healthy. So as an example tied in with your question, it's possible, I think, to talk about self-esteem and and that balance that needs to be struck between liking and loving ourselves in healthy ways as well as others in our life.
Right. I see this whole dynamics of the educators, whether it be the teachers, that if they have the awareness of it from childhood the whole way up, and knowing if everybody across the board would have this check your ego type of a thing, I think life would be a little bit different. So I'll tell you what, we have about 2 minutes left. And, of course, I want to thank you for being on the show.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, Joe. And also, it's always an honor to have somebody listen to you talk about stuff.
Absolutely.
But also to your audience.
Is there anything, like in 30 seconds, you would like to leave our listeners with?
I would say that the big pieces of our lives are connected to our ego and how it is working in our lives. And if one isn't happy with where their life is, if it's not being fulfilled in the way they would like it to be, I would suggest that the first place they look is their ego and to understand it more.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you all for tuning in. And let's see. So the next thing we got tonight is a radio show. It's from 8 to 10 Eastern Daylight Time. And if you like, you can log into the website at www.universaltalk.info. We'll be discussing a positive human future with President Dwight D. Eisenhower's great-great-granddaughter, Laura Eisenhower. And, of course, I want to thank you all for tuning in to our show. If you like the show, dislike the show, any other questions or suggestions for future content, email me at universaltalking@gmail.com. Or if you missed the show or some of the show and you'd like to listen to the content, simply log on to my website at universaltalk.info. And this is Joe Marra signing off for Universal Talk.